The notification came through at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, the kind of cold corporate email that didn't bother with pleasantries. Budget restructuring. Workforce optimization. Effective immediately. 3-month severance if Declan Hartwell cleared his desk by noon. The HR manager who'd hired him 2 years earlier couldn't meet his eyes when she walked him to the elevator, her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown he couldn't stop. $18,000. That's what 28 years of doing everything right had purchased him. High school valedictorian scholarship to Northwestern, 4 years, debugging code for a company that shipped his entire department to Bangalore without blinking. The severance check would cover 3 months of rent on an apartment that suddenly felt cavernous, echoing with the absence of everything he'd built and lost. The divorce papers were waiting when he got home, tucked inside his mailbox like a punchline he should have seen coming. Cordelia's attorney had used expensive stationery, the kind with embossed letterhead that probably cost more than Declan made in a week back when he still had a job. Irreconcilable differences, equitable distribution of assets, joint custody of minor child alternating weekends and major holidays. 12 years of marriage reduced to bullet points and legal boilerplate signed by a woman who'd promised to love him in a church filled with people who probably didn't remember his name anymore. He sat in the kitchen they'd picked out together back when they were young and stupid enough to believe in forever, and tried to make the numbers work. The spreadsheet didn't lie. Rent, utilities, insurance, groceries, child support. At his current burn rate, he'd be bankrupt by Christmas. The California job posting glowed on his laptop screen, a lifeline he couldn't quite bring himself to grab. $140,000 a year to write code for a startup that would probably fold in 18 months, but at least he wouldn't have to explain to Iris why they were moving into Grandma's basement. His phone rang while he was calculating how many days until eviction. The ringtone was his mother's, that cheerful default melody that felt obscene against the wreckage of his afternoon. Her voice carried the weight of news that couldn't wait for a better time. Your grandfather August passed away last night. The funeral's Saturday. There's something else. He left you the farm. Declan's first thought was that she'd made a mistake. He'd seen Gus maybe 3 times in the past decade, stilted conversations at Thanksgiving tables where the old man barely spoke and Declan ran out of questions to ask. The farm was a place from childhood summers, vague memories of tire swings and barn cats, and the particular quiet that settles over Iowa fields at dusk. He didn't know the first thing about crops or livestock or keeping a tractor running through harvest. Why would Gus give him 16 acres of land he'd never wanted and couldn't manage? I don't understand. Why me? His mother's pause stretched long enough that he checked to see if the call had dropped. When she finally answered, her voice carried an edge he couldn't quite place. The lawyer says you need to attend the will reading. Gus was very specific about his intentions. The statement raised more questions than it answered, but Declan's mother had already moved on to logistics. The funeral was Saturday at 2. She'd made calls. People were coming from as far as Des Moines to pay respects to a man who'd farmed the same ground for 7 decades and never left Warren County except to bury his brothers. Thursday morning brought an email from Cordelia. Work emergency, can't take Iris this weekend. Could he please handle it? The message arrived at 6 a.m., timed perfectly to catch him before he could make other arrangements. Her new boyfriend probably had tickets to something, a concert or a play that couldn't be rescheduled. Declan typed 3 different responses, each one angrier than the last, before deleting them all and writing back a single word. Fine. Iris was waiting on the apartment steps when he pulled up Saturday morning, her backpack stuffed with books and the tablet she wasn't supposed to bring to his place. 8 years old, all knees and elbows, and fierce determination not to cry where anyone could see. She'd gotten taller in the 2 weeks since he'd seen her last, or maybe he just kept forgetting how fast she was growing up without him. The rental car smelled like industrial air freshener and previous customers' regrets. Declan couldn't afford to fly them both to Iowa, not with the severance already earmarked for next month's rent. 6 hours on I-80 watching cornfields blur past while Iris worked through a stack of graphic novels and pretended she didn't notice her father's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. The farmhouse appeared around a bend in County Road 42 exactly as Declan remembered it, and completely different somehow. White clapboard siding weathered to gray in patches where the paint had surrendered to decades of Iowa winters. Green shutters that might have been cheerful once back when someone cared enough to maintain them. The wraparound porch sagged slightly on the north corner, and the whole structure seemed to lean into the oak trees that surrounded it like old men propping each other up at a funeral. Iris pressed her face against the window, eyes wide, with the kind of wonder only 8-year-olds can still access. Is that where Great-Grandpa Gus lived? It's like a castle. The observation landed somewhere between Declan's ribs, a sharp reminder of the cramped 2-bedroom apartment where his daughter spent every other weekend, where the neighbors complained if she laughed too loud, and the closest thing to a yard was a strip of brown grass next to the parking lot. She'd grown up with balconies instead of backyards, community pools instead of creeks. Nature reduced to the park 2 blocks over where the playground equipment was always broken and the grass never quite looked alive. The driveway was already crowded with vehicles by the time they arrived. His uncle's Ford pickup, his mother's practical sedan, Vaughn's black SUV that probably cost more than Declan's annual salary back when he still had one. Relatives he barely recognized spilled out of the farmhouse, speaking in the hushed tones people adopt around death, as if the deceased might wake up and shush them. His mother appeared on the porch, eyes red-rimmed but dry. The kind of exhausted grief that comes from knowing loss was inevitable and arriving anyway. She pulled Declan into an embrace that smelled like the perfume she'd worn his entire childhood, then knelt to Sophie's level with the particular intensity grandmothers reserve for grandchildren they don't see often enough. "You've gotten so tall, sweetheart. Look at you." Iris accepted the hug with the awkward grace of a child who knew she was supposed to be sad, but wasn't entirely sure why. She'd never really known Gus had no memories to mourn except the vague impression of a very old man who didn't talk much and smelled like pipe tobacco and old wood. Inside the farmhouse was exactly as Declan remembered it. The living room with its worn furniture and faded wallpaper, the kitchen with its ancient appliances and linoleum floor, cracked in patterns that probably dated back to when Gus first installed it. Relatives clustered in small groups sharing stories about a man who'd apparently touched more lives than Declan realized, who'd helped neighbors through the farm crisis of the 80s, who'd been first to arrive when someone's barn burned down or their tractor broke during harvest. His father stood by the fireplace nursing a beer and looking uncomfortable. They hadn't spoken in 3 months, not since Declan mentioned the divorce, and his father responded with a lecture about commitment and staying the course. 15 years since his own divorce from Declan's mother, and the old man still thought he had standing to judge. Vaughn Brennan was impossible to miss. He stood near the kitchen archway, expensive suit tailored to disguise the 40 pounds he'd gained since high school, expensive watch glinting as he gestured with his drink. Declan's cousin had always been larger than life, the kind of aggressive confidence that came from being the biggest kid in every room and never learning otherwise. He'd started a real estate development company right out of college, leveraged family connections and his father's money into an empire of strip malls and housing developments that sprawled across 3 counties. Their eyes met across the room. Vaughn's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to catalog, landing somewhere between contempt and calculation. He'd offered Declan a partnership 6 years ago, back when the development company was expanding and needed someone who understood technology. Declan had turned him down, choosing to stay in Chicago with Cordelia and the stable corporate job that no longer existed. Vaughn hadn't forgiven him for the rejection, had made that clear at every family gathering since. The funeral was mercifully brief. The pastor was young, probably fresh from seminary, reading from notes about a man he'd clearly never met. August Hartwell, beloved grandfather, dedicated steward of the land, quiet pillar of the community. The words were true enough, but missed something essential, some core element of who Gus actually was beneath the farmer's overalls and taciturn exterior. Iris sat beside Declan on the hard church pew, asking whispered questions he didn't know how to answer. Why was everyone so quiet? What happened to Great-Grandpa? Where did people go when they died? The theology got complicated fast. So Declan settled for holding her hand and hoping that was enough. Back at the farmhouse, the lawyer waited in the kitchen. Mr. Preston was thin enough that his suit looked borrowed wire-rimmed glasses perched on a nose that seemed designed for looking down at documents. He'd spread papers across the kitchen table where Gus had eaten every meal for 7 decades, the same scarred oak surface that had probably witnessed more history than Declan could imagine. The will was straightforward until it wasn't. Standard bequests to various relatives, small sums to local charities, farm equipment distributed among neighbors who'd helped maintain it. Then Preston cleared his throat and read the section that changed everything. I, August, James Hartwell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my farm consisting of the main residence, all outbuildings, and 16 acres of land located at 1857 County Road 42 to my grandson Declan Michael Hartwell. The silence that followed was absolute. Declan felt every eye in the room turn toward him, felt the weight of expectations he couldn't possibly meet. Then Vaughn's voice cut through the quiet like a blade through rotten wood. "This is ridiculous. Declan doesn't know which end of a plow to hold. He wouldn't recognize a combine if it ran him over." The lawyer started to respond, but Vaughn was already building momentum, the kind of aggressive certainty that had served him well in business and made him insufferable at family dinners. "Dad and I have been helping maintain this property for years. Everyone assumed it would go to someone who could actually manage it. Gus must have been confused when he wrote this. The medications, the dementia." Preston's voice remained level, professional, unbothered by the outburst. "I assure you Mr. Hartwell was of completely sound mind when he updated his will this past March. He was quite specific about his wishes and his reasoning." Iris had gone very still beside Declan, her small hand gripping his with the particular intensity of a child who knows something bad is happening but doesn't understand the rules. Vaughn's face had flushed red, the color creeping up from his expensive collar to his receding hairline. He opened his mouth to continue, then seemed to think better of it, settling for a look that promised this conversation wasn't over. The silence stretched again until Preston shuffled his papers and continued reading, but Declan barely heard the rest. His mind was already racing through implications, consequences, decisions he didn't want to make. The farm was worth something, obviously, or Vaughn wouldn't care. But how much? And what would it cost to maintain? The property taxes alone were probably more than his monthly rent. After the reading concluded and most of the relatives had filtered out, murmuring condolences and avoiding eye contact, Vaughn cornered Declan in the hallway. His expression had shifted to something more calculating, the anger replaced by the particular smile salesmen use right before closing a deal. "Look, I know this is overwhelming. You've got a life in Chicago, a career in tech. The last thing you need is 16 acres of Iowa farmland you don't know how to work. I'm prepared to make you a fair offer. $150,000 cash close in 30 days. You could be back in Chicago by Monday with a check in your hand and this whole mess behind you." The number was larger than Declan had expected and smaller than he suspected the property was actually worth. Before he could respond, Iris pulled on his sleeve with surprising force. Her face had gone fierce, that particular expression she got when someone was being unfair, and she knew it. "Dad's not selling. We're going to be farmers." The declaration hung in the air like a challenge. Vaughn's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Out of the mouths of babes," he said, but his eyes had gone cold. "Listen to your daughter, Declan. This isn't a place for city people playing country. You have no idea what you're getting into." Before Declan could formulate a response that wouldn't make things worse, Vaughn's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, jaw tightening, then stepped away with a parting shot delivered over his shoulder. "My offer stands until Friday. After that, you're on your own with whatever you dig up." The phrasing was odd, specific in a way that suggested Vaughn knew more than he was saying. But then the moment was gone, and Declan was left standing in the hallway of a house he apparently owned with a daughter who thought they were going to be farmers and a cousin who clearly wanted them gone. That evening, after the last of the relatives had departed, and the farmhouse settled into the particular quiet that comes with grief and exhaustion, Iris discovered the photograph. She'd been exploring the living room bookshelf while Declan tried to process everything that had happened, pulling down volumes with the careful curiosity of a child in a place full of mysteries. "Dad, look what I found." The frame was simple wood darkened with age and dust from years wedged behind agricultural almanacs. 3 young men stood proudly in front of a brand-new tractor, their faces split with identical grins that suggested they knew exactly how good life was about to get. The tractor gleamed green and yellow in what must have been bright sunlight chrome details catching the light like promises. Scrolled across the bottom in fading ink, "The Hartwell Brothers Promise, 1946. Declan recognized Gus immediately, the shortest of the 3, maybe 25 years old, with his whole life ahead of him. The resemblance was unmistakable in the shape of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the particular way he held himself like a man trying not to take up too much space in the world. But the other 2 men were strangers. One tall and serious-looking, the other with laugh lines already forming around his eyes despite his youth. Brothers Declan had never heard of, never knew existed. "Who are they?" "I don't know, sweetheart. I didn't know Grandpa Gus had brothers." The sound of the back door opening interrupted them. Lavinia Calloway entered without knocking, carrying a covered dish that smelled like home in a way that made Declan's throat tight. She was exactly as he remembered from childhood visits. Silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, ramrod posture that made her seem taller than her actual 5 feet 4 inches, eyes that missed nothing and forgave most things. "Nobody should cook on funeral day," she announced, setting the dish on the kitchen counter. "Chicken and dumplings. Gus's favorite, though he always claimed mine were second best to his mother's." Iris had appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the smell of real food after a day of grief casseroles and store-bought cookies. Vinnie's face softened in the particular way older women's faces soften around children, all sharp edges blunted by grandmotherly affection. "You must be Declan's daughter. You've got the Hartwell eyes, same as your daddy and great-grandpa, strong eyes, the kind that see what matters. Iris beamed under the attention, following Vinnie into the kitchen to help set the table, while Declan located plates and silverware that still lived in the same drawers they'd occupied during his childhood visits. The domesticity of it felt surreal against everything else that had happened, this moment of normalcy in a day that had redefined his entire future. Over dinner, Vinnie filled the silence with stories Declan had never heard. Gus helping her family through the drought of '88 when their well ran dry. Gus fixing tractors for neighbors who couldn't afford mechanics. Gus at church suppers and town meetings, never saying much but always showing up when it mattered. A portrait of a man Declan had known but never really understood, someone who'd built a life out of quiet dedication to land and community and promises kept. He was mighty pleased when you came to visit as a boy. Would talk about you for days after. How smart you were, all the questions you asked about everything. Declan nearly choked on his water. He did. Vinnie's smile suggested she knew exactly how surprising this information was. Gus wasn't one to show his feelings much, but he was proud of you. When your robotics team made the state championships, he saved every article. Had them framed in his bedroom. The revelation hit harder than it should have. All those years thinking Gus barely noticed him, barely cared, when apparently the old man had been following his life with the quiet intensity he brought to everything else. Declan had assumed the distance was indifference, when it might have been something else entirely. Some inability to translate feeling into words that seemed to run in the family. Iris had wandered back to the living room during the conversation, drawn to the photograph she'd discovered earlier. She returned now with the frame held carefully in both hands, presenting it to Vinnie like a detective with crucial evidence. "Who are the other men?" with great-grandpa Vinnie's breath caught audibly when she saw the photograph. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the frame, and for a moment she seemed to be looking at something very far away, some memory that lived on the other side of 70 years and all the grief that came with them. "Where did you find this?" Gus didn't keep photos out. "Not of them." She traced a finger over the glass, gentle as a prayer. "Emmett and Silas, Gus's older brothers. They went to war. World War II. Neither one came home." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything Declan thought he knew about his family history. He'd never heard anyone mention that Gus had brothers, let alone brothers who'd died in the war. The gaps in family narrative suddenly felt less like oversight and more like deliberate erasure, some wound so deep that speaking of it might tear open scars that had barely healed. "What happened to them?" Vinnie glanced at Iris, then back at Declan. clearly calculating what was appropriate to discuss in front of an 8-year-old at the end of a long day. Some stories are better told another time. It's late and you both have had more than enough for one day. But she didn't put the photograph down. Immediately, kept staring at it like she could see past the silver halide and yellowed paper to the moment it captured when 3 young men stood in front of their brand-new tractor and believed the future was something they could farm together. That tractor was their pride and joy. Bought it together just before Emmett and Silas shipped out. Victory Series John Deere, one of the special ones made right after the war. They drove it home from the dealership, all 3 together, proud as you can imagine. After Vinnie left, promising to return with breakfast and extracting a promise from Declan that he wouldn't make any hasty decisions about the farm, he tucked Iris into the guest bedroom. The room was exactly as it had been during his childhood visits. Faded quilts stitched by hands, long dead floorboards that creaked in familiar patterns, window that looked out over dark fields, stretching toward a horizon he couldn't see. "Will we really live here, Dad?" "I don't know, sweetheart. We have a lot to figure out." Iris was quiet for a moment, her face illuminated by the nightlight he'd found in the bathroom. When she spoke again, her voice carried the particular wisdom children sometimes access when adults aren't listening carefully enough. "I hope we do. It's like an adventure. Better than our apartment." The statement shouldn't have hurt as much as it did, but Declan felt it land somewhere vital. Their apartment, with its thin walls and thinner prospects where Iris had to be quiet because the neighbors complained, and the closest thing to nature was the half-dead houseplant Cordelia had left behind. Here she could run and shout and discover things without someone telling her to keep it down. Be careful, stay inside where it's safe. After she fell asleep, Declan allowed himself to wander the farmhouse properly, opening doors to rooms he vaguely remembered and spaces he'd never been permitted to explore as a child. Gus's bedroom was spare to the point of ascetic. A neatly made double bed with a quilt that matched the one in the guest room, a dresser with a few photographs in simple frames, a nightstand with a well-worn Bible and a pair of reading glasses folded carefully on top. The closet contained a row of nearly identical flannel shirts and denim overalls, the uniform of a man who'd never seen clothes as anything but functional. But it was the nightstand drawer that stopped Declan cold. Inside, beneath the expected detritus of a long life, he found a stack of papers held together with a rubber band that crumbled when he touched it. Property tax statements showing annual payments on 16 acres that had apparently been in the family since 1923. Insurance documents for equipment Declan couldn't identify and didn't know how to maintain. Bank statements revealing a careful man's careful management of limited resources, every deposit and withdrawal recorded in precise handwriting, savings accumulated through decades of discipline and depleted in a single year by medical bills that must have corresponded with Gus's final illness. The property taxes were due October 15th, 3 weeks away. $12,247. More than half of Declan's severance money he'd already mentally allocated to next month's rent, and the month after that, and the month after that, until he found another job that probably didn't exist. But beneath the financial documents, he found something that made the numbers irrelevant. A stack of letters, each one addressed to Declan at various Chicago addresses, each one never sent. The earliest dated back 15 years, the most recent from just 6 months ago. He opened the top one with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Dear Declan, I saw your robotics team won the state championship. I wanted to call but didn't know what to say. I'm not good with words the way your mother is, but I wanted you to know I was proud. Your father would have been too if he'd bothered to pay attention. Some men don't know what they have until it's gone. I hope you're smarter than that." The next letter was shorter, dated 3 years ago. "Dear Declan, I heard about your wedding. I should have come, but I'm not good at those things, all the people and the noise. I hope she makes you happy. I hope you make each other happy for longer than most people manage. Marriage is harder than farming, and that's saying something." The most recent was barely a paragraph written in a hand that trembled more than the earlier letters. "Dear Declan, I'm sorry I was never good with words. There are things I should have told you, stories about your family that matter more than I realized when I was young enough to think I had time. I'm leaving you the farm because I think you're the only one who'll ask the right questions. The answers are there if you know where to look. I hope I was right about you. I hope you find what needs finding." Declan read each letter twice, then a third time, trying to reconcile these words with the silent old man he'd known. Gus had been watching his life from a distance, caring in the only way he knew how, building a bridge he'd never learned to cross. And now he was gone, and the bridge was incomplete, and Declan was standing in a bedroom that smelled like pipe tobacco and old wood, holding evidence of love that had never quite learned to speak its own name. The kitchen calendar was still turned to September, Gus's precise handwriting marking off the days with notations that told the story of a farmer's life. Plant winter wheat, check irrigation, order seed. But the entry that caught Declan's attention was 3 weeks old, circled in red ink with an emphasis that suggested urgency. Doctor's appointment. Final results. Gus had known he was dying. Had known when he updated his will in March, had known when he wrote that last letter in April, had known through the summer while Declan was losing his job and his marriage and his sense of what came next. And somehow across the distance and the silence and all the things they'd never learned to say to each other, Gus had decided that Declan was the right person to inherit 16 acres and a farmhouse full of secrets. Sleep came fitfully interrupted by dreams of tractors and men in military uniforms, faces Declan had never seen, but somehow recognized. He woke before dawn to birdsong instead of traffic, to darkness that was absolute, rather than the perpetual glow of city lights filtering through inadequate curtains. The farmhouse settled around him with creaks and sighs, the particular sounds old structures make when they've seen generations come and go and have learned not to be surprised by anything. He made coffee in Gus's ancient percolator, the kind that belonged in a museum but still worked better than the expensive machine Cordelia had registered for and abandoned in the divorce. The back porch was cold in the pre-dawn September air, but Declan stood there anyway, watching the sun break over the horizon and paint the fields gold. 16 acres of corn standing green and promising in the early autumn light. To the north, the barn and several outbuildings, their silhouettes familiar from childhood, but mysterious now that they belonged to him. And beyond the barn, where the cultivated land gave way to wilderness, a section of property he'd been warned away from as a child. Too overgrown, Gus had said. Too dangerous for a boy to go poking around. Trees and brush and old sinkholes that could swallow you up if you weren't careful. But Declan wasn't a boy anymore, and the warning suddenly felt less like concern for safety and more like something else. A secret hidden in plain sight waiting for someone curious enough to look. He finished his coffee and crossed the dewy grass toward the barn. The structure was massive, built sometime in the 20s with hand-hewn beams and traditional mortise and tenon joinery, the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore because nobody wanted to pay what it cost. Inside, morning light streamed through dust-filmed windows, illuminating old farm equipment arranged with the same precision Gus had brought to everything else. Tools hung in careful rows along one wall, each one in its designated place. A workbench ran the length of the back wall, its surface scarred from decades of projects, but still fundamentally sound. Below it, cabinets with neatly labeled drawers, nails, screws, electrical. Everything organized by size and function, a testament to a mind that believed in order even when the world outside insisted on chaos. But it was what lay beyond the barn that drew Declan forward. The gate was rusted but functional, opening onto the section of property that had been forbidden territory during his childhood visits. The neglect was immediately apparent. Unlike the carefully maintained fields and yard, this area had been allowed to go wild. Volunteer trees and thick brush created a natural barrier obscuring whatever lay beyond. But there were signs of previous activity if you looked for them. Old fence posts marching in irregular lines. The remnants of what might have been a road, now overgrown but still visible in the pattern of vegetation. And mounds. Strange earthen mounds that were too regular to be natural, too deliberate to be random. One mound in particular caught his attention. Larger than the others, its shape suggested something buried beneath something deliberately covered and left to be reclaimed by nature over years or decades. Declan stood at the edge of the cleared area, staring at disturbed earth that might hold answers to questions he didn't yet know how to ask, and felt the weight of inheritance settle across his shoulders like a coat he'd never chosen but couldn't take off. Behind him, the farmhouse lights flickered on. Iris was awake, probably wondering where he'd gone. And somewhere in the distance, roosters were announcing dawn to a world that had been turning without Declan's attention for 28 years. He'd come to Iowa for a funeral, and found a mystery instead. Gus's final letter had been right about one thing. The answers were here if he knew where to look. The sound of tires on gravel pulled him back to the present. He turned to see Vinnie's truck pulling into the driveway right on schedule with the promised breakfast. But behind her, already parked near the house, sat Vaughn's black SUV. His cousin had arrived early, probably hoping to catch Declan before he was fully awake and thinking clearly. Declan walked back toward the farmhouse, leaving the forbidden area and its buried secrets for later. Whatever Gus had hidden here, whatever story the photograph and the unsent letters and the strange mounds were trying to tell, it would have to wait. First he needed to deal with Vaughn and Vinnie and the immediate question of what came next. But as he crossed the yard with the barn and the unknown behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real choice had already been made somewhere in the pre-dawn quiet, standing at the edge of secrets that had waited 70 years to be uncovered. The land would still be here tomorrow and the day after, holding on to whatever promises three brothers had made in 1946 when the world was different and the future seemed like something you could cultivate if you just worked hard enough and kept your word. Vaughn was waiting on the porch steps when Declan emerged from the barn, coffee cup in hand, and mind still half caught in the puzzle of overgrown land and deliberate burial. His cousin had positioned himself to block the front door, arms crossed over his chest in a posture that suggested this conversation would happen whether Declan wanted it or not. "You've been exploring." Stating the obvious seemed to be Vaughn's opening gambit this morning. Declan walked past him toward where Vinnie was unloading a basket from her truck, the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls cutting through the September chill. "It's my property. Seems like something I should do." Vaughn followed him down the steps with the persistence of a man accustomed to getting his way through sheer relentlessness. "That's exactly my point. You don't know this land, don't know what's out there or what condition it's actually in. The barn could have structural issues. The fields might be contaminated. There are environmental concerns you haven't even thought about." The specificity of the warnings felt rehearsed, like Vaughn had spent the drive over crafting arguments designed to seed doubt. Declan accepted a cinnamon roll from Vinnie with a grateful nod, letting his cousin build momentum while he tried to parse what was actually being said beneath the surface noise. "Property taxes are due in 3 weeks. $12,000 you probably don't have, considering your situation. The equipment is decades old, probably worth more as scrap than functional machinery, and the house needs work that'll cost more than it's worth to fix. You're looking at pouring money into a hole that'll never give anything back." Each point landed with the weight of truth which made them harder to dismiss. Declan's severance wouldn't cover the taxes and next month's rent. His job prospects were limited to positions that would require relocation or massive pay cuts. The farm was a financial anchor he couldn't afford and didn't know how to manage. "So take my offer, $150,000 cash, 30-day close. Walk away clean and start over somewhere that actually makes sense for your life." Before Declan could formulate a response, Iris appeared in the doorway behind Vaughn, sleep-tousled and curious. She'd clearly caught enough of the conversation to understand what was being proposed. "We're not selling." The declaration carried more conviction than Declan felt, but Vaughn's expression shifted to something uglier. He turned to face Iris with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your daddy needs to make smart decisions, sweetheart. This farm isn't a game or an adventure. It's serious business that requires serious knowledge." Vinnie had stopped unloading her truck to watch the exchange, her posture radiating the kind of stillness that preceded storms. When she spoke, her voice carried 60 years of knowing exactly how men like Vaughn operated. "The child understands what you seem to have forgotten, Vaughn. Some things matter more than money." Vaughn's jaw tightened. "This is family business, Vinnie. With all respect, it doesn't concern you. I've known this family longer than you've been alive. Known it well enough to recognize a vulture when I see one circling. The insult hung in the air between them, sharp enough to draw blood. Vaughn's face flushed the particular red that preceded either retreat or escalation. His phone buzzed before he could choose some urgent message that demanded immediate attention. He glanced at the screen, then back at Declan with something that might have been frustration or calculation or both. "My offer expires Friday. After that, you're on your own with whatever mess you inherit here." The phrasing echoed what he'd said yesterday, that same emphasis on whatever you dig up that suggested knowledge he shouldn't possess. Then he was striding toward his SUV, gravel, crunching under expensive shoes gone in a spray of dust that settled slowly across the morning. Vinnie climbed the porch steps with her basket, ushering Iris inside with gentle efficiency. "That man's been sniffing around this property for months. Started even before Gus got sick. Something's got him convinced there's value here beyond 16 acres of corn." "What kind of value?" "If I knew that, I'd tell you. But Gus always said this land was special. Said it held things that mattered more than crop yields or market prices. I figured he meant memories, family history. Now I'm not so sure." Over breakfast, Declan made the call he'd been putting off. "Mr." Preston answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a small-town lawyer handling an estate more complicated than it appeared. "I need to understand what I'm actually dealing with here. Vaughn's claiming there are issues with the property. Environmental concerns, legal complications. Is any of that true?" Preston's pause lasted long enough that Declan's stomach dropped. Then the lawyer cleared his throat, shuffling papers that rustled through the phone connection. "No pending legal issues that I'm aware of. Gus's affairs were meticulously organized. Property taxes are current through last year. Insurance paid up no liens or encumbrances. The environmental concerns Vaughn mentioned are pure fiction as far as I can determine. Then why is he so eager to buy?" Preston hesitated again, choosing his words with the care lawyers employ when approaching uncomfortable truths. "I can't speculate on your cousin's motivations, but I can tell you that land values in Warren County have increased significantly in the past 5 years. Several large agricultural corporations have been purchasing small farms, consolidating holdings. Gus refused multiple offers, some quite generous. The last one came in at $300,000 for the 16 acres. The number was double what Vaughn had offered, which meant his cousin had been lowballing hard and hoping Declan wouldn't know better. But it still didn't explain the urgency, the barely concealed desperation beneath Vaughn's pressure tactics. Why would he leave it to me instead of someone who actually knows farming? Preston's answer came softer, like he was reading from notes he'd made long ago and kept private until now. "He told me you were the only one who ever asked questions about the old days, the only one who wanted to know the real stories instead of the comfortable lies families tell themselves. He said you had the kind of mind that wouldn't let mysteries stay buried." After the call ended, Declan sat at the kitchen table while Iris helped Vinnie with breakfast dishes, their voices a pleasant background hum that reminded him of mornings that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. His mother's number was already in his recent calls. This conversation needed to happen before courage failed him. She answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting for him to call with questions she'd known were coming. "Why didn't anyone tell me Grandpa Gus had brothers who died in the war?" The silence stretched long enough that he checked to make sure the connection hadn't dropped. When his mother finally spoke, her voice carried a weight he'd never heard before. "Oh, Declan, that's complicated in ways I'm not sure I can explain. Try. Because I've got a photograph of 3 young men standing in front of a tractor and 2 of them are strangers to me. That seems like the kind of thing a family should mention. Gus made us promise never to speak of them. Made everyone promise, all the relatives who remembered. He said the pain was too much, that talking about Emmett and Silas would only make it worse. And after a while it became easier to pretend they'd never existed than to keep explaining why we couldn't talk about them. The explanation felt insufficient, a rationalization that might have made sense 70 years ago, but couldn't justify decades of erasure. Declan pressed harder, feeling the anger rise in his chest. They served their country and died and got written out of family history because it hurt too much to remember them. That's not honoring their sacrifice, that's pretending they never mattered. His mother's voice cracked, the first real emotion breaking through her careful composure. "You're right. You're absolutely right. And I've known it for years, but knowing doesn't make it easier to undo. When I was your age and asked about the photograph I found, Gus sat me down and explained that some wounds run so deep that exposing them to air just makes them bleed harder. He asked me to respect that his grief was his own, and I did. And by the time I was old enough to question whether that was right, the silence had become family tradition. But he left me the farm. Why would he do that if he wanted everything buried? The answer came slowly, like his mother was working through logic she'd never fully examined. When he changed his will last March, he told me something I didn't understand at the time. He said you were the only one who ever asked questions about the real past, instead of accepting the sanitized version. He said he thought you'd want to know the truth even if it was hard, maybe especially if it was hard. He said you'd find what needed finding. The phrase echoed the final unsent letter, that same conviction that Declan possessed some quality Gus had been waiting for. But what was he supposed to find, and why did it require inheriting 16 acres to do it? After his mother hung up with promises to visit soon and help sort through Gus's belongings, Declan returned to the bedroom he'd explored the night before. The closet and nightstand had yielded secrets, but there had to be more. Gus had been too methodical, too careful to leave his story incomplete. The bookshelf in the living room drew him back. Iris had found the photograph wedged behind agricultural almanacs, which suggested Gus had been hiding things in plain sight, trusting that whoever looked closely enough would find what mattered. Declan began pulling volumes methodically, checking behind each row until his hand touched something that wasn't book. The wooden box was small enough to fit in one hand, plain pine darkened with age. No lock, no markings, nothing to indicate significance beyond the deliberate concealment. Inside, letters still in their original envelopes, postmarks faded but legible. Military mail from 1943, 1944, 1945. The handwriting on the envelopes varied, but all were addressed to August Hartwell, Route 2, Warren County, Iowa. Declan spread them across the kitchen table in chronological order, a paper trail of years when the world was at war and three brothers were separated by oceans and circumstances. Emmett's letters came from Europe, the return addresses tracking his movement through England, France, Germany. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural, each letter formed with the care of someone who believed penmanship revealed character. The tractor arrived today 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Dealers said they're prioritizing agricultural orders now that boys are coming home and farms need modernizing. I've been walking past it every morning checking to make sure it's real and not some dream I'll wake up from. Can't wait to see your faces when Silas and I get home and we can work it together like we planned. Another letter dated 2 months later carried different weight. The precision was still there, but the content had shifted toward things unsaid, trauma hiding behind careful phrasing. The things we saw in that village outside Munich would break your heart, Gus. Not the combat that's clean in its own terrible way, but what they did to people, to families, to children. We're trying to save what we can document, what can't be saved. There's an art historian attached to our unit now teaching us to recognize what matters. Says culture is the soul of civilization, and if we let the Nazis destroy it, they win even in defeat. Silas's letters formed a counterpoint written in sprawling script that suggested someone who couldn't keep his thoughts contained on the page. His personality bled through every line, the youngest brother who'd gone to war, thinking it would be adventure, and found something else entirely. Tell Emmett to stop being so serious in his letters. We're going to come home, we're going to farm that land together, and we're going to make something amazing. The tractor is just the start. I've been thinking about expansion, mechanization, all the modern techniques they're teaching in the agriculture programs. By the time we're through, the Hartwell farm will be the most productive 16 acres in Iowa. The optimism was almost painful to read, knowing what came next. The last letter from Silas was dated April 1946, weeks after the war ended, full of plans for the homecoming and the life they'd build. Shipping out next week on a transport to San Francisco, then train to Des Moines. Should be home by mid-May at the latest. I'm bringing gifts for everyone, things I've collected that you can't buy stateside. Tell Mother to make her Sunday pot roast because I've been dreaming about it for 3 years. Tell Emmett to have the tractor gassed up because first thing I want to do is take it for a proper run through the North Field. Beneath the letters, wrapped in a separate envelope, Declan found the journal. leather-bound, small enough to fit in a pocket embossed on the cover with a single year 1946. Gus's handwriting filled every page, the chronicle of a year that had shaped everything that came after. The entries started optimistic, full of plans and preparations for his brother's return. Then they shifted, darkened, became the diary of someone watching his world collapse in slow motion. May 15th. Bought the new John Deere today. Cost more than I wanted to spend, more than we probably should have spent with the loan still outstanding on the back 40. But with Emmett and Silas both home now, we need the machine to work the extra acres we're planning to lease from the Johnson place. The three of us drove it from the dealership together, took turns at the wheel like kids with a new toy. Silas says the two-cylinder engine sounds like a heartbeat, the pulse of the farm. Emmett's already planning how we'll use it to expand into the north field come fall. June 3rd. Emmett received his Silver Star today. Small ceremony at the courthouse, just family and a few local veterans. He refused to talk about what he did to earn it, changed the subject every time someone asked. The nightmares wake him most nights. I can hear him through the wall crying out in languages I don't recognize, seeing things none of us can unsee for him. Silas says to give him time, that some wounds don't show on the outside, but run deeper than any battlefield injury. July 12th. The telegram came this morning. Silas's plane went down somewhere over Nevada on the flight to San Francisco. Mechanical failure, no survivors. Remains will be shipped home for burial. Mother hasn't stopped crying since the Western Union man left. I don't know how to tell Emmett, who's in Des Moines meeting with the bank about our expansion loan. He was counting on Silas to help with the new acreage. We were all counting on Silas. The entry ended there, the rest of the page blank, like Gus couldn't find words for what came next. The following entries were sporadic, dated weeks apart, chronicling the slow disintegration of whatever future they'd imagined. August 2nd. Emmett's drinking now. Started right after we buried Silas, hasn't stopped. The doctor gave him pills for the nightmares, but they don't help, or he doesn't take them. Caught him in the barn last night crying and talking to himself about things he saw in Germany. He keeps saying he failed, that he couldn't save what mattered, that everything he touched turned to ash. I don't know how to help him when I can barely hold myself together. October 8th. I'm writing this in the hospital, waiting for them to release what's left of Emmett's body so we can bury him next to Silas. He took the tractor out last night, drunk or desperate or both. Hit the washout on the road to Willow Creek doing 40 miles an hour. The machine rolled, pinned him underneath. Sheriff says death was instant, but I saw what was left, and instant doesn't mean painless. 3 brothers 4 months ago, 1 brother now. I don't know how to keep farming land that's been paid for in blood and grief. November 28th. Made a decision today that probably makes me crazy, but I can't use the tractor anymore. Every time I see it, I see them. Emmett planning field rotations. Silas laughing about the engine sound, both of them believing the future was something we could cultivate together. But I can't sell it either. It's the last thing we all touched as brothers before everything fell apart. I'm going to preserve it, bury it somewhere safe until the day comes when the pain isn't quite so sharp. Maybe my children will find it, or their children. Maybe someone will understand why I had to do this. November 30th. Buried the John Deere behind the barn today in the section I'm going to let grow wild. Drained all the fluids, greased every moving part, wrapped the whole machine in wax canvas I ordered special from the catalog. It took all day and felt like burying my brothers all over again. But I know this is right. Someday someone who asks the right questions will find it. And they'll know that Emmett and Silas Hartwell lived and dreamed and loved this farm. They'll know we made promises we meant to keep, even if death had other plans. Declan closed the journal with hands that weren't entirely steady. The mound behind the barn wasn't random. It was a memorial, a time capsule, a promise kept across decades. And if Gus had buried the tractor, what else had he hidden in that overgrown section of land? Iris found him still sitting at the table. An hour later, the journal opened to that final entry, reading words that reached across 70 years to explain why a taciturn old man had never spoken of his brothers. Some grief ran too deep for casual conversation, some losses carved channels in the soul that never quite filled in. "You okay, Dad?" The question pulled him back to the present. He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, and watching him with concern that shouldn't be her responsibility, and made a decision. How would you like to help me find some buried treasure?" Her face lit up with the particular excitement only children can access, that absolute conviction that adventure was always one discovery away. They gathered tools from the barn, shovels and pruning shears and thick gloves against thorns. Declan explained what they were looking for without explaining everything they might find, turning archaeology into game investigation, into treasure hunt. The morning was clear and cool, perfect September weather for work that would leave them both filthy and exhausted. Declan marked the largest mound based on measurements he'd paced off using landmarks from Gus's journal entry. Then he handed Iris the smaller shovel and started clearing brush. 2 hours in, they'd exposed enough of the mound to confirm it wasn't natural. The earth had been deliberately piled, shaped left to settle and be reclaimed. Iris worked beside him with determined focus, hauling cut branches to the growing pile of debris, asking questions about why someone would bury a perfectly good tractor and whether it still worked after being underground for so long. Declan was 3 feet deep, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the autumn chill, when the blade struck something that rang with metallic resonance. The sound froze both of them, that crystalline moment when possibility became certainty. "What was that?" "I think we found it, sweetheart. Let's keep digging carefully." Another foot down and the shape became unmistakable. Curved metal painted in colors that had faded but remained recognizable. Green and yellow, the iconic John Deere palette that hadn't changed in 80 years. Declan expanded the hole, working around what was clearly the front of a tractor, exposing the grille and headlights and the distinctive 2-cylinder engine housing that Silas had compared to a heartbeat. By noon, they'd uncovered enough to confirm Gus's journal hadn't been metaphorical. The 1946 Victory Series John Deere sat in its earthen cradle exactly as it had been left, preserved with the same meticulous care Gus had brought to everything else in his life. The wax canvas wrapping had deteriorated in places, but beneath it the machine looked almost new, protected from rust and rot by preparation that bordered on religious devotion. Iris was practically vibrating with excitement, dancing around the excavation pit and declaring this the best treasure hunt ever. Declan was calculating logistics, trying to figure out how to extract a piece of equipment that weighed north of 3,000 pounds from a hole he'd dug by hand when he heard the trucks. Multiple vehicles coming up the drive, engines and voices carrying across the still morning air. Declan climbed out of the pit to see what looked like half the county pulling into his yard. Roscoe Milliken led the procession in a battered pickup that had probably been old when Declan was born. Behind him came 3 more trucks, each carrying men Declan vaguely recognized from the funeral neighbors Gus had helped over the years, who were returning the favor now that he was gone. Vinnie emerged from the farmhouse where she'd been doing mysterious kitchen things, wiping her hands on a towel and surveying the arrivals with satisfaction. "Told Roscoe you might need some help with a special project. Word spreads fast in farm country." Roscoe was weathered in the way people get when they've spent 60 years under the Iowa sun, all permanent tan and laugh lines and hands that told the story of every rock he'd pulled from a field. He walked to the edge of the excavation pit and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. Heard stories about this, but figured they were just stories. That's a Victory Series John Deere manufactured special after the war. They don't make them like this anymore. Haven't made them like this in 70 years. The other farmers gathered around, offering observations and opinions with the particular authority men develop when machinery is the subject. They spoke in a language Declan only half understood, discussing displacement and torque and hydraulic systems like other people discussed weather. But beneath the technical talk ran something deeper, a recognition that they were excavating more than equipment. They were uncovering a piece of history, a monument to brothers who died before they could farm the land they'd fought to defend. Vinnie appeared at Declan's elbow, voice soft enough that only he could hear. "Knew about the tractor for 70 years. Gus swore me to secrecy, said it was too painful to explain. But he always said someday someone would find it, someone who cared enough to ask why. You could have told me. Saved me the digging. Some discoveries matter more when you make them yourself. Besides, Gus wanted you to read the journal. Understand the story before you understood the artifact. The machine's just metal and rubber. The why is what makes it sacred. The farmers worked with the efficiency of people who'd spent lifetimes solving practical problems. Roscoe's son arrived with a flatbed trailer and a winch powerful enough to extract the tractor without damaging it. They rigged straps with care that bordered on reverence, positioning everything to distribute weight and prevent the kind of catastrophic failure that would destroy what they were trying to save. Iris watched from a safe distance. Vinnie had designated, practically bouncing with excitement as the winch engaged and the tractor began to rise. Inch by inch, it emerged from the hole that had hidden it for 7 decades, wax canvas falling away to reveal the machine beneath. When it finally cleared the edge of the pit and sat proud in the September sunlight, everyone went quiet. The preservation had been better than anyone expected. Paint was faded but intact. Chrome showed some surface oxidation but no deep pitting. The tires, protected from UV degradation, looked like they might still hold air. The distinctive brass plaque mounted on the engine cowling gleamed dully Victory Series, in honor of those who served, 1946. Below it a smaller plate had been added sometime after the original manufacture. The engraving was simple, direct, heartbreaking in its brevity, property of E.S. and G. Hartwell. Roscoe ran his hand along the fender with the gentleness men reserve for things that matter. Whoever buried this knew exactly what they were doing. Drained fluids, greased everything, wrapped it proper. Meant for it to be found someday, wanted it to survive. A flutter of white caught Declan's attention as the tractor settled onto the trailer. Something had worked loose from the undercarriage during extraction, a small weathered envelope that had been wedged into a crevice where weather couldn't reach it. He retrieved it before anyone else noticed, brushing dirt from paper that felt fragile as butterfly wings. The envelope was sealed with wax that crumbled at his touch. Inside, a single sheet folded around something small and metallic. The handwriting was different from Gus's journal. More flowing letters formed with dramatic loops that suggested someone who'd learned penmanship as art rather than function. October 12, 1946. Dear Gus, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. You know I've never been one for morbid thoughts, but after losing Silas, I can't shake the feeling that borrowed time is all any of us have left. The nightmares are getting worse despite the pills Dr. Morrison prescribed. Sometimes I'm back there in that forest in Germany, seeing things no man should see, failing to save things no man should lose. I've made arrangements with Martin at First National. The boxes are in both our names. The key enclosed will open my deposit box number 42. What's inside belongs to both of us now, though I'm the one who brought it home, and you're the one who'll have to decide what to do with it. Use it if you need to, save it if you can. Most importantly, keep it safe. There are people who would kill for less. Remember our promise under the oak tree the night before I shipped out. The land stays in the family no matter what happens. It's not just dirt and crops, Gus. It's something more, something worth protecting, even when protection costs everything we have. Especially then. If I don't come back from my midnight drive someday, don't mourn too much. Maybe I'll finally get some sleep without the dreams. Take care of Mother. Take care of the farm. And if you ever find the right person to tell the truth, to make sure they understand what we were trying to do here. Make sure they know we meant well even when we got it wrong. Your brother always, Emmett. The brass key that had been folded inside the letter was small enough to fit in Declan's palm, stamped with a number that matched the one in Emmett's note. 42. A safety deposit box that had been waiting for 70 years at First National Bank, holding secrets that people would kill for. Declan pocketed the letter and key before anyone could ask questions he didn't know how to answer. The farmers were discussing restoration strategies, debating whether the engine could be saved or would need complete rebuilding. Roscoe estimated 8,000 in parts and labor to get it running, maybe 20,000 for a full restoration that would return it to showroom condition. The numbers were staggering, but Roscoe's expression suggested he wasn't talking about money. This is history. This is 3 brothers who bought a machine together and never got to farm with it. You don't restore something like that halfway. You do it right, or you don't do it at all. The discussion was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle. This one Declan recognized immediately. Vaughn's black SUV roared up the drive like mechanical fury, spraying gravel as it fishtailed to a stop. His cousin emerged, already shouting, face flushed with anger that had clearly been building during the drive over. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "This is my property until the courts say otherwise. I've got surveyors coming next week, engineers scheduled to assess the structures. You can't just dig up whatever you want." The familiarity in Vaughn's ranting suggested he'd expected to find something had known about the buried tractor despite never visiting the farm during Gus's lifetime, which meant someone had told him, or he'd found documentation, or he'd been researching the property with the kind of thoroughness that went beyond casual interest. "This is my property. The will was clear and you know it. What I dig up on my own land is none of your concern." Vaughn's eyes locked onto the exposed tractor and something shifted in his expression. Recognition mixed with calculation followed by what might have been fear before his features settled into aggressive certainty. "Where did you find out about this?" The question confirmed Declan's suspicion. Vaughn knew about the tractor, had known before today, which meant the pressure to buy wasn't about normal land speculation. His cousin was hunting for something specific, and he'd just watched it emerge from the ground in front of witnesses who would make concealing it impossible. "About what I found a journal in Grandpa's things that mentioned he'd buried some equipment. Seemed worth investigating." Vaughn stepped closer, lowering his voice below the range where the farmers could hear. "Listen carefully. There are things about this farm you don't understand, things Gus kept buried for reasons that go beyond sentiment or grief. You need to stop digging, cover this back up, and walk away before you cause problems you can't fix." The words were nearly identical to what he'd said on the porch that morning, but the delivery had changed. This wasn't bluster or sales pressure. This was genuine warning wrapped in threat, concern bleeding through the edges of anger. Iris was still watching from her designated safe spot, and Vaughn's gaze flickered toward her before returning to Declan. "Think about that little girl. Think about what you're exposing her to by playing amateur archaeologist on land you don't understand." The implicit threat against his daughter ignited something primal in Declan's chest. He stepped forward close enough to smell the coffee on Vaughn's breath and spoke with the kind of calm that preceded violence. "Get off my property, right now. Before I forget we're family and remember you just threatened my child." For a long moment it seemed like Vaughn might escalate, might push the confrontation into territory neither of them could walk back from. Then movement caught both their attention. Vinnie was walking toward them from the farmhouse, and she was carrying a shotgun. The weapon was pointed at the ground, safe and controlled, but its presence reframed the entire conversation. Vinnie's expression carried the particular serenity that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and being completely comfortable with the consequences. "Everything all right over here, gentlemen?" I heard raised voices and thought maybe someone might need help clarifying the situation. Vaughn's face went through several colors before settling on a shade of red that suggested either fury or humiliation or both. He retreated toward his SUV, movements jerky with suppressed rage. "This isn't over. You have no idea what forces you're dealing with, Declan. No idea what you've just uncovered or who's been waiting for it." Then he was gone in another spray of gravel and dust, leaving silence that felt loaded with unspoken implications. Vinnie lowered the shotgun, catching Iris's wide eyes and softening into something grandmotherly. "Don't worry, honey, it's not loaded. Just for show. Sometimes men behave better when they think there might be consequences for their foolishness." The farmers drifted back to their trucks after securing the tractor on the trailer, offering final words of advice about restoration and recommendations for specialists who could handle the delicate work. Roscoe was the last to leave, pausing beside Declan with an expression that suggested he'd seen more than the surface of what just happened. "Your cousin's been asking questions around town for months. Started even before Gus got sick. Wanted to know about property history, mineral rights, any unusual activity over the years. Most folks told him to mind his own business, but some talked. Word is he's been researching something specific, though nobody knows exactly what." After they'd all departed and the afternoon settled into the particular quiet that follows intense activity, Declan made another call to Preston. The lawyer listened to the morning's events with the kind of patient attention that suggested he was taking notes. "I need to access a safety deposit box at First National. Number 42. I have the key, but I don't know if I have legal standing to open it." Preston was quiet for a moment, and Declan could hear papers rustling. That box was opened by August and Emmett Hartwell in 1946. According to bank records I pulled when preparing the estate, your grandfather has been paying the annual fees continuously for 70 years. The box has never been opened since the original rental. What's in it, I have no idea. But given Gus's pattern of careful documentation, I suspect whatever is inside matters more than the fees would justify. You'll need to present the death certificate and proof of inheritance, but yes, you have standing to access the contents. Monday morning found Declan dressed in the closest thing to professional clothes he'd brought to Iowa, walking into First National Bank with Iris's hand in his and a brass key in his pocket that might unlock answers to questions he was only beginning to formulate. The building was exactly what small-town banks looked like in collective imagination. Marble floors, high ceilings, woodwork that predated anyone's living memory. Mr. Carson, the bank manager, was balding and bespectacled, precisely the kind of officious gatekeeper institutions employed to make everything take longer than necessary. He examined Declan's documentation with the thoroughness of someone who'd built a career on never making exceptions. This is highly unusual. Safety deposit box contracts typically include provisions for automatic termination after extended periods of inactivity. But according to my lawyer, my grandfather has been paying the annual fees for 7 decades. Carson adjusted his glasses, peering at papers like they might suddenly reveal different information. That's true, but the box has never been accessed. We have no record of Mr. Hartwell ever opening it after the initial rental. Before Declan could argue further, an elderly woman emerged from an office behind the main counter. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd earned the right to take her time. Silver hair, perfectly styled posture that suggested she'd been telling men like Carson how things actually worked since before Declan was born. That's quite enough, Mr. Carson. I'll handle this. She extended a hand to Declan, grip surprisingly firm. Eleanor Prescott, Chairman Emeritus. I knew your grandfather well enough to know he wouldn't have maintained that box for 70 years without good reason. In the special holdings vault where boxes too large for the main area were kept, Mrs. Prescott supervised while Carson used his master key in conjunction with Declan's brass key to unlock box 42. The metal case inside was approximately 18 inches square, heavier than it looked, sealed with another lock that would require the second key Declan didn't yet have. Whatever's in there has been waiting a long time. Mrs. Prescott's eyes carried the kind of knowing that came from witnessing decades of small-town secrets. Your grandfather was a good man who made hard choices during hard times. I hope what you find helps you understand why. The case sat heavy on Declan's lap during the drive back to the farm, Iris chattering beside him about the marble floors and high ceilings and the very old lady who seemed like she knew everything about everyone. He wasn't ready to open it yet, wasn't ready to discover what Emmett had considered worth hiding and Gus had considered worth maintaining. But Emmett's letter had included a second key, and Declan had a pretty good idea where to find it. The tractor sat in the barn, now covered with the same tarp the farmers had used during transport. He searched the undercarriage methodically until he found what he was looking for. Another envelope wedged into a crevice, this one containing a smaller brass key, and nothing else. The case lock yielded with a click that sounded too loud in the barn's quiet. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth and wax paper, lay pieces of a puzzle Declan was only beginning to see. Leather portfolio containing hand-drawn maps, some showing European landscapes he didn't recognize, others depicting sections of the Hartwell farm with coordinates and cryptic notations, a stack of documents stamped with classified in red ink that had never faded, photographs of artwork, dozens of them each with handwritten notes about provenance and estimated value. And beneath everything else, a small leather notebook in the same flowing handwriting as Emmett's letter. Declan opened it to the first page, reading words that transformed everything he thought he understood about his inheritance. The documents revealed Emmett's wartime service in careful detail. Not just infantry, not just another soldier in another company. He'd been attached to a specialized unit with a mission that sounded more like fiction than history. The Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program tasked with locating and securing cultural treasures looted by Nazi forces. Emmett had been hunting stolen art across collapsing Germany, working with art historians and museum curators to save pieces of civilization from destruction and theft. The photographs documented his discoveries, paintings and sculptures and religious artifacts stolen from Jewish families who'd been murdered in camps with names Declan recognized from history books he'd read in school. The Kleinfeld collection. Emmett's notes detailed its recovery from a castle in Bavaria, artwork worth millions, even in 1945 dollars. The provenance was clear, the ownership undisputed, the rightful heirs identified through genealogical research Emmett had conducted himself during the final months of the war. But something had gone wrong. The final entries in the notebook told the story in fragmentary details, partial truths that suggested trauma Emmett couldn't fully articulate even years later. September 1946. Transport arrangements compromised. Ashford cannot be trusted. Evidence suggests Nazi sympathizers in the local government tipped off about the recovery operation. 2 of the Kleinfeld pieces unaccounted for after the firefight in Stuttgart. We took casualties, lost men whose names I'm not supposed to write down but can't stop thinking about. Silas agrees. The remainder cannot go through official channels until we can determine who compromised the operation and whether the security breach extends higher than local corruption. Temporary secure storage established using the maps and coordinates I've surveyed on the farm. God forgive me if this is wrong, but these treasures have seen enough violence. They deserve protection, even if that protection means hiding them from the very people who should be receiving them. The maps in the portfolio made sudden, terrible sense. They showed the farm, specifically the section behind the barn that Gus had let grow wild and forbidden anyone to explore. Coordinates marked a precise location beneath what the topographical survey indicated was the old root cellar sealed and buried sometime in the early 50s. Declan spread the maps on the barn workbench, aligning them with modern property surveys he'd found in Gus's meticulous files. The root cellar entrance had been sealed from the outside, covered with concrete that had then been disguised with soil and vegetation. But the coordinates suggested it was still there, still intact, still holding whatever Emmett and Silas had hidden 70 years ago. Worth killing for, Emmett had written. People who would kill for less. Which meant whoever had compromised the original recovery operation, whoever this Ashford was that Emmett couldn't trust, might still be interested in finding what had been hidden. The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm Declan hadn't expected to find. Harvest came with Roscoe's patient instruction, teaching him to read fields and weather patterns, to operate equipment that seemed impossibly complex until it became second nature. The corn came in better than anyone predicted, enough to cover the property taxes with money left over for winter preparations. Iris enrolled in the local school after Cordelia agreed to modified custody during a surprisingly civil phone conversation. The apartment in Chicago felt like someone else's life, now a chapter that had closed without anyone quite noticing the moment it happened. Iris made friends who knew what 4-H meant, brought home art projects depicting tractors and barns instead of skyscrapers, started talking about joining the volleyball team in spring. Cordelia visited for Thanksgiving, her first time seeing the farm. She walked the property with Declan while Iris helped Vinnie prepare dinner, neither of them quite knowing how to navigate the space between what they'd been and what they were becoming. She's different here. Happier, maybe, or just more herself. Declan nodded, watching Iris through the kitchen window, animated in a way she rarely was during their Chicago weekends. The divorce had hurt her more than either of them wanted to admit, but maybe distance was letting them all breathe in ways proximity never had. You could visit more often. Stay in the guest room. I'm not trying to complicate things, just acknowledging that she needs both of us. Cordelia's smile carried something that might have been relief. I'd like that. And December, I'm glad you found this. Whatever this is. Winter settled across the fields like a promise of spring that seemed impossibly distant. The case from the bank sat hidden beneath Gus's bed through December and January and into February, waiting. Declan researched the Kleinfeld Foundation during long evenings while Iris did homework at the kitchen table, traced descendants through genealogy databases, built understanding of what Emmett had tried to protect and why Gus had kept the secret for so long. The answer lay in the Ashford family history documentation Declan pieced together from county records and old newspaper archives. Thomas Ashford had been a prominent real estate developer in the 1940s, built an empire on connections that looked increasingly suspicious the deeper Declan dug. German industrialists, wartime collaboration, the kind of activities that would have been treasonous if anyone had bothered to investigate. When Emmett discovered evidence during the art recovery operation, Ashford had orchestrated the security breach that got soldiers killed and scattered the Kleinfeld collection. He'd spent the rest of his life searching for what Emmett had hidden past that obsession to his son, and apparently to his grandson, before dying in January of 2025. The timing crystallized everything. Thomas Ashford II had died in January. Gus had updated his will in March, recording his video confession and documenting his intentions with Vinnie as witness. He'd been waiting for the threat to pass for the right moment to reveal what his brother had hidden. Then illness had intervened, stealing the time he needed to finish what Emmett had started. The ground was just beginning to thaw in early March when Deputy Harris arrived with papers that changed everything. The injunction was printed on official letterhead stamped and sealed by a judge Declan had never heard of. The law firm listed in the corner made his stomach drop. Wagner, Ashford and Associates. Vaughn had filed a challenge to the will, claiming Gus had been mentally incompetent when he made the changes. The hearing was scheduled for Tuesday, March 18th, which gave Declan exactly 5 days to build a defense against accusations he'd known were coming since the day Vaughn first mentioned whatever you dig up. The injunction sat on the kitchen table like a coiled snake, legal language that translated to a simple message: stop digging or face contempt charges. Declan stared at it while Iris asked questions about what it meant and whether they'd have to leave the farm. He tried to explain in 8-year-old terms that sometimes adults had to let courts decide things that Vaughn didn't believe Gus had been thinking clearly when he wrote the will. But Great-Grandpa knew what he was doing, right? He wanted us to have the farm. The conviction in her voice reminded Declan why he was fighting this. Not for the land or the hidden artwork or even the mystery of 3 brothers and their promises. For Iris, who'd found something here she couldn't find in Chicago, who'd bloomed in ways that made Cordelia cry with relief during their weekly video calls. Vinnie appeared before breakfast the next morning, letting herself in through the back door with the familiarity of someone who'd been doing it for decades. She carried a manila folder pressed against her chest, like it contained state secrets. Before you make any decisions about selling or leaving or giving up, there's something you need to see. Gus gave me this 2 months before he got sick, made me promise to show it to you only if you found the tractor and started asking the right questions. The document inside was dated March 15, 2025, notarized by Vinnie herself in her capacity as a certified notary for the senior center. 3 pages in Gus's precise handwriting, the same careful formation of letters that had filled the journal and the unsent letters Declan had discovered in the nightstand drawer. The heading was simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. Letter of intent regarding the Kleinfeld collection. What followed was a confession and a plan, decades of silence finally broken by a man who knew his time was running out. Gus detailed Emmett's role in the Monuments program, the recovery of artwork stolen from Jewish families who'd perished in camps, the firefight in Stuttgart that had killed 2 members of the recovery team and scattered pieces of the collection. He explained Emmett's decision to hide the remaining artwork temporarily to keep it safe until the security breach could be investigated and the proper channels secured. Then he documented what came after. Emmett's death and the tractor accident, leaving Gus alone with a secret too dangerous to reveal. The threats from Ashford's father, a prominent real estate developer with connections to former Nazi collaborators, claiming the artwork belonged to German families who'd lost property during the war. Gus's fear that exposing the collection would lead to legal battles that might keep the pieces tied up in courts for decades, while the rightful heirs received nothing. I maintained my brother's secret longer than I should have. Fear became habit, and habit became inertia. Each year that passed made disclosure more difficult, as questions would inevitably arise about why the art had remained hidden for so long. But the truth is simple. 3 young men scarred by war and burdened by tragedy made decisions that became a legacy none of us anticipated. The final paragraph hit hardest words that reached across the months since Gus's death to explain why Declan stood in this kitchen reading this document, facing this choice. I am leaving the farm to my grandson Declan Michael Hartwell because I trust he will complete this mission if I become unable to do so myself. Declan possesses the intellectual curiosity to uncover the truth and the moral integrity to honor it. If I cannot complete this task myself, I entrust it to him knowing that some promises take generations to keep, but they are always worth keeping." Vinnie's voice was soft when she finally spoke, giving Declan time to absorb what he'd read. He had me witness this the same day he recorded a video confession. Said if anything happened to him before he could contact the Kleinfeld Foundation, you'd need proof that he was of sound mind when he made these decisions. Said you'd need ammunition against anyone who tried to claim he was senile or confused. The implications were staggering. Gus had been preparing for this confrontation, anticipating that someone, probably Vaughn working with the Ashford family, would challenge the inheritance and try to claim the artwork. He'd documented everything, created a paper trail that proved competence and clear intent, armed Declan with weapons for a battle he'd known was coming. "Can you testify to his mental state when he signed this?" Vinnie's smile carried 70 years of watching men underestimate her. "I'm a notary, dear. My testimony about his competence is already part of the legal record. But more than that, I can testify to 30 years of conversations where Gus talked about finding the right time to reveal the collection, about researching the Kleinfeld heirs, about wanting to do right by his brother's memory. He wasn't hiding the art because he wanted to keep it. He was protecting it until he could return it properly." Declan placed the call to the Kleinfeld Foundation that afternoon, using contact information he'd found in Gus's research files. The organization's website detailed decades of work recovering and repatriating artwork looted during the Holocaust, connecting surviving family members with cultural treasures stolen from their ancestors. The form asked for a description of the inquiry, and Declan kept it simple. "I have information about pieces from your missing Kleinfeld collection." The response came within an hour, faster than seemed possible for an organization of that size. Dr. Miriam Adler, the Foundation's director, would be available for a video call at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Iowa time. The email included a secure link and a request that Declan have documentation ready to share. Iris was helping Vinnie bake something that involved an alarming amount of flour when Declan set up his laptop in Gus's bedroom, the only room in the farmhouse with reliable internet and enough privacy for a conversation that might determine the next 70 years of family legacy. Dr. Adler's face appeared on screen precisely at 4, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, eyes sharp behind frameless glasses. "Mr. Hartwell, I'll be direct because my time is limited, and yours is probably more so. The Kleinfeld collection has been missing since 1946. We've spent decades trying to locate it, following leads that went nowhere, interviewing veterans who remembered the recovery operation, but not what happened to the pieces afterward." "What do you know?" Declan shared his screen displaying the photographs from Emmett's notebook. Dr. Adler's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the laptop speakers. She leaned forward, eyes tracking across images she'd probably spent years hoping to find. "Where did you get these? Who are you really?" "Emmett Hartwell was my great-uncle. He was part of the Monuments program attached to a unit that recovered the collection from a castle in Bavaria. Something went wrong during transport. Some pieces were lost. Others my uncle hid temporarily on our family farm. They've been there ever since." The silence stretched while Dr. Adler processed information that rewrote her organization's understanding of one of their longest-running cases. When she spoke again, her voice carried professional skepticism wrapped around barely restrained excitement. "This requires extensive verification, obviously, but if these are genuine photographs of the missing Kleinfeld pieces, if the artwork has been preserved as your documents suggest, this represents one of the most significant recovery events in our history. We need to discuss logistics, authentication, legal protocols for repatriation. There's a complication. My cousin is trying to block access to the property through court injunction. He's working with a law firm that shares a name with someone my uncle identified as compromising the original recovery operation. I think they've been searching for this collection for 70 years. Dr. Adler's expression hardened into something that suggested she'd dealt with opportunistic treasure hunters before and knew exactly how to handle them. The Kleinfeld Foundation has extensive legal resources for precisely this situation. When is your hearing? Tuesday morning, March 18th. I'll be on the first flight to Des Moines tomorrow. My team will bring documentation establishing our claim as representatives of the Kleinfeld heirs. More importantly, we'll bring evidence that your grandfather was acting in good faith to preserve and eventually return stolen property, not to conceal it for personal gain." After the call ended, Declan sat in the darkening bedroom listening to Iris's laughter drift up from the kitchen where she and Vinnie were probably making an unholy mess of whatever baking project had seemed like a good idea. The weight of responsibility should have felt crushing, but instead he felt something else. Purpose, maybe. Or clarity. For the first time since losing his job and his marriage, and his sense of what came next, he knew exactly what he was supposed to be doing. The next 3 days blurred into preparation that felt like studying for the most important exam of his life. Dr. Adler arrived Tuesday evening with 2 associates, efficient people who transformed Gus's living room into a command center of laptops and legal documents. They verified Emmett's photographs against cataloged records, confirmed provenance through genealogical research, built a case that made Declan's inheritance look less like opportunity and more like obligation. Meanwhile, Roscoe and the farmers continued restoring the tractor, despite the injunction's prohibition against further excavation. The machine sat in the barn like a monument to what they were really fighting for, 3 brothers who'd believed in promises that outlasted their lives. The farmers worked with quiet determination, treating the restoration as both honor and defiance, their way of telling Vaughn and the Ashfords that some things mattered more than legal maneuvering. Iris absorbed the activity with 8-year-old resilience, treating the invasion of serious adults as an adventure rather than a crisis. She brought Dr. Adler coffee and asked questions about the paintings and the photographs, wanted to know why people stole beautiful things and whether the families who lost them were still alive to get them back. Her innocence cut through the complicated history like a blade through fog, reducing everything to simple truths about right and wrong. Monday evening brought an arrival nobody had anticipated. The sedan that pulled into the drive was modest, American-made, at least a decade old. The man who emerged moved with the careful deliberation of someone fighting pain with every step, leaning heavily on a cane that looked more medical than decorative. He was ancient, possibly the oldest person Declan had ever seen, still ambulatory, skin like parchment stretched over bones that seemed too fragile to support even his minimal weight. Vinnie met him on the porch, and whatever passed between them involved a conversation too quiet for Declan to hear. Then she was guiding the stranger into the farmhouse, settling him into the most comfortable chair with the solicitousness usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. "Declan, this is Cornelius Ashford. He has something to say." The name landed like a physical blow. Ashford, the family that had betrayed Emmett's operation, that was now representing Vaughn in his attempt to seize the property. Declan's first instinct was to throw the old man out, but something in Vinnie's expression suggested this required listening rather than reacting. The voice that emerged was surprisingly strong for someone who looked like a strong breeze might shatter him. "You look like him. Like August when we were young before the war took his brothers and grief took everything else. I knew your grandfather well enough to recognize the Hartwell stubbornness in your face." "Who are you, Cornelius Ashford's son? Thomas Ashford's nephew? The one who spent 83 years trying to make up for what my family did? The one who's dying of pancreatic cancer and figured 3 months was long enough to finally do the right thing?" He reached for a leather portfolio with hands that trembled from more than age. Inside were documents that painted a portrait of collaboration and betrayal spanning generations. Thomas Ashford had worked with German industrialists before the war, maintained relationships that became treasonous after Pearl Harbor, leveraged those connections afterward to build a real estate empire on the bones of families who'd lost everything. When Emmett Hartwell discovered evidence of these activities during the art recovery operation, Thomas had orchestrated the security breach that got 2 soldiers killed and scattered the Kleinfeld collection. My father believed the artwork included pieces that rightfully belonged to his German associates' families, pieces acquired legally before the Nazi regime, then confiscated along with truly stolen items during the chaos of war's end. He spent the rest of his life trying to recover what he claimed was stolen from people he claimed were victims. And what do you believe? Neil's smile was bitter enough to curdle milk. "I spent 60 years researching every piece your uncle photographed, tracked provenance through archives in Vienna, Berlin, Munich. Interviewed survivors when I could still find them their children when I couldn't. Not a single item in that collection has any legitimate claim against it. Every piece was owned by the Kleinfeld family, documented in their gallery records, stolen during Kristallnacht when their business was destroyed and they were sent to camps. Then why is your family's law firm representing my cousin in trying to seize my property? Because Vaughn doesn't know the truth. Thomas Ashford II. My cousin died in January. He spent his whole life believing his grandfather's lies, searching for the collection his father claimed was rightfully theirs. He told Vaughn enough to make him think there was value here, but not enough to explain the real history. Now Vaughn's chasing ghosts, and I'm the only one left who knows they were lies from the beginning. Dr. Adler had been listening from the doorway, arms-crossed expression, suggesting she'd heard similar stories before and knew how to evaluate their authenticity. You're willing to testify to this, in court under oath, contradicting your own family's interests. I'm dying anyway. Might as well die honest. The portfolio contains everything my father's deathbed confession, the research proving Kleinfeld ownership correspondence showing Thomas knew the truth and lied anyway. Vaughn doesn't know I'm here. We've been estranged for years because I refused to participate in the family fiction that we were victims rather than collaborators. Iris appeared in the doorway with a cup of tea. She'd apparently made herself approaching Neil with the fearlessness only children possess around fragility. You look sad. Do you want some tea? The old man's eyes filmed over, and for a moment Declan thought he might actually weep. Instead, he accepted the cup with hands that shook so badly, Iris steadied them with her own small fingers. Thank you, child. That's very kind. Nobody's been kind to me in a long time. After Neil left, promising to return for Tuesday's hearing with testimony that would demolish Vaughn's case, Vinnie supervised while Iris got ready for bed. Declan stood on the back porch watching darkness settle across fields that had witnessed more history than he'd imagined. The land endured beyond the brief flicker of human ambition, measuring time in geological terms that made decades feel like heartbeats. Tuesday morning arrived with the particular clarity that comes before storms. Sky so blue it hurt to look at, directly air carrying the last warmth of winter before spring asserted dominance. The Warren County Courthouse dated from the 1890s limestone facade and columned entrance projecting permanence that had outlasted everyone who'd built it. Inside the wood-paneled courtroom was already filling with more people than Declan expected. Farmers who'd helped excavate the tractor, Vinnie and the neighbors who'd known Gus for decades. Reporters drawn by Dr. Adler's presence, recognizing that something significant was unfolding in this small-town legal proceeding. Vaughn sat at the plaintiff's table with two attorneys who looked expensive, their suits tailored to disguise the fact that they were arguing for someone with no legitimate claim. His expression carried the confidence of someone who believed money and legal maneuvering could overcome inconvenient truths like documented history and authenticated provenance. Judge Patricia Morrison entered with the efficiency of someone who'd been presiding over this courtroom for 20 years and had seen every variation of human nature parade through it. She was younger than Declan expected, maybe early 50s, with eyes that suggested she didn't suffer fools and wouldn't appreciate anyone wasting her time. Vaughn's attorneys presented their case with the smooth professionalism that came from winning through procedural complexity rather than moral clarity. They questioned Gus's mental competence during his final illness, pointed to medical records showing periods of confusion, medication side effects, decisions that seemed erratic or unexplained. They painted a picture of an old man making irrational choices, leaving valuable property to a grandson who'd barely visited, rather than family members who'd maintained the farm for years. The performance was polished, rehearsed, almost convincing if you didn't know the actual story. Declan watched from his seat beside Dr. Adler's legal team, feeling the weight of 3 generations pressing down on his shoulders. This wasn't just about property or money or even hidden artwork. This was about honoring promises made by men who'd died believing those promises would outlast them. The counter-evidence felt almost anticlimactic in its straightforwardness. Vinnie testified about Gus's clear thinking when he signed the letter of intent, her notary certification making her word legally binding. She spoke with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 70 years watching her community, who knew the difference between a confused old man and someone making difficult but necessary choices. He was as sharp at 95 as he'd been at 50. Talked to me for 2 hours about his research into the Kleinfeld heirs, about the Foundation's work recovering Nazi-looted art, about wanting to do right by Emmett's memory before it was too late. That's not dementia. That's a man with a plan who ran out of time before he could finish it. Dr. Adler presented documentation of Gus's research into Kleinfeld heirs, showing years of methodical investigation that proved he'd been planning restitution long before his final illness. Computer files meticulously organized correspondence with Holocaust research centers dating back to the early 2000s, genealogical records that tracked surviving family members across 3 continents. The portrait that emerged was of someone building toward disclosure with the same careful precision he'd brought to farming. Preston submitted the video Gus had recorded, and the courtroom went silent as his voice filled the space. Declan watched his grandfather on screen, sitting in the living room that was visible through the courthouse windows just a few blocks away, speaking with clarity that demolished any suggestion of incompetence. I'm making this recording because I need there to be no doubt about my intentions or my mental state when I make them known. I am 95 years old. I am dying of congestive heart failure. My doctors have given me between 4 and 8 months. My mind is sound. My memory is intact. And I am choosing to leave my farm to my grandson Declan, because I believe he is the right person to finish what my brother Emmett started in 1946. The video continued for another 10 minutes, Gus explaining the history in detail, acknowledging that his silence had lasted too long, but insisting it had been motivated by legitimate fear rather than greed or confusion. When it ended, several jurors were wiping their eyes, and even Vaughn's attorneys looked uncomfortable. But the momentum shifted decisively when Neil Ashford took the stand. Despite his frailty, despite the cane he needed just to walk from the gallery to the witness box, his testimony carried the weight of someone unburdening himself of truths that had been poisoning him for decades. The bailiff swore him in, and Neil settled into the chair with visible relief, like he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment. Doctor. Adler's attorney began with gentle questions establishing Neil's identity, his relationship to the Ashford family, his professional credentials as a historian who'd spent 6 decades researching World War II art recovery. Then they got to the heart of it. Mr. Ashford, can you explain your family's involvement in the events of 1946? Neil took a deep breath, hands trembling as he gripped the armrests. My grandfather Thomas Ashford was a real estate developer who built his fortune on connections to German industrialists before and during the war. Those connections became liabilities after Pearl Harbor, but he maintained them through various intermediaries. When the Monuments program began recovering artwork looted by the Nazis, my grandfather saw an opportunity. What kind of opportunity? To claim that certain pieces rightfully belonged to his German associates. To argue that the artwork had been acquired legally before the Nazi regime, then confiscated by Allied forces, along with truly stolen items. It was a lie, but it was a profitable one if it worked. And did it work? Not the way he hoped. Emmett Hartwell, who was part of the recovery team, discovered evidence of my grandfather's wartime collaboration. He refused to go along with the false claims, so my grandfather compromised the security of the transport operation. 2 American soldiers died in the resulting attack. Several pieces of the Kleinfeld collection were lost. The rest scattered. Vaughn's attorneys objected repeatedly, claiming the testimony was irrelevant to questions of testamentary capacity. Judge Morrison overruled them with increasing impatience, her expression suggesting she'd figured out what this case was really about and didn't appreciate having her time wasted with procedural nonsense. On the contrary, this testimony speaks directly to the credibility of the challenge. If Mr. Brennan's interest in this property stems from knowledge of hidden assets rather than legitimate concern about his uncle's mental state, that context is absolutely relevant to my determination. Neil continued, his voice strengthening as he approached the moral core of his testimony. His words painted a picture of betrayal that had echoed across generations. Secrets passed from father to son, like heirlooms that poisoned everyone who touched them. I've spent my entire adult life researching the truth about every piece my grandfather claimed his associates had rights to. I've examined gallery records in Vienna, interviewed survivors and their descendants, tracked provenance through archives in 4 countries. Not a single item has any legitimate competing claim. Every piece was owned by the Kleinfeld family, documented in their business records stolen during Kristallnacht in 1938, when their gallery was destroyed and they were sent to camps where most of them died. He turned to address Vaughn directly, and the courtroom went so quiet that the air conditioning's hum seemed loud. His nephew's face had gone pale, then red, cycling through emotions too quickly to catalog. Our family has been on the wrong side of this story since 1946. We collaborated with enemies, betrayed American soldiers, built fortunes on the bones of Holocaust victims while pretending we were the ones who'd been wronged. I've carried that knowledge for 60 years, and I won't carry it to my grave. Neil's hands gripped the armrests harder, knuckles white with the effort of staying upright. Some debts can't be paid with money or legal maneuvering, Vaughn. Some require simply admitting the truth and stepping aside. Let this man finish what was started 70 years ago. Let the Kleinfeld heirs receive what was stolen from their family. Be the Ashford who finally does the right thing. The judge called a brief recess, and Declan found himself in the courthouse hallway surrounded by Dr. Adler's team trying to process the surreal experience of watching family dysfunction play out in legal proceedings that would determine whether he could keep his home. Vaughn approached with his attorneys trailing behind their expressions, suggesting they'd advised against this conversation, but couldn't stop him. You have no idea what you've unleashed. There are interested parties beyond my development company who've been tracking this collection for decades. International dealers, private collectors, people who don't operate through legal channels. You think winning today makes you safe. The threat was barely veiled desperation bleeding through aggressive posturing. But Declan had spent the last 5 months learning that some things mattered more than safety or comfort or avoiding conflict. He stepped closer, matching his cousin's energy with calm that felt more dangerous than anger. Then let them come. Let them step into the light and make their claims legally through proper channels with documentation and provenance and all the things your family never had. We both know they won't because they can't. The rightful owners have been identified. The foundation represents them. This ends today, one way or another. Judge Morrison's ruling came after a recess that felt interminable but probably lasted 20 minutes. She delivered it with the decisive clarity of someone who'd seen enough to recognize truth when it presented itself, who wouldn't be swayed by expensive lawyers or complicated genealogies or procedural maneuvering designed to obscure simple moral questions. The injunction against property alterations is lifted immediately. Mr. Brennan's challenge to the will is dismissed with prejudice, meaning similar claims cannot be refiled. Furthermore, this court formally recognizes the Kleinfeld Foundation's interest in the artwork described in Mr. Emmett Hartwell's documentation. Mr. Declan Hartwell, as legal owner of the property, is ordered to cooperate fully with proper restitution procedures, ensuring these cultural treasures are returned to their rightful owners through appropriate channels. Vaughn departed without further confrontation, his defeat comprehensive enough that even his attorneys seemed relieved it was over. But he paused at the courtroom door, looking back with an expression Declan couldn't quite read. Not anger or calculation this time. Something closer to exhaustion, maybe, or the particular weariness that comes from discovering everything you believed about your family history was built on lies. That evening, Vaughn appeared at the farm alone. No attorneys, no aggressive posturing, just a man who looked like he'd aged a decade in the hours since the hearing. He carried a manila envelope, its bulk suggesting substantial contents, and his movements had lost their usual aggressive certainty. I read everything Neil provided to the court. My grandfather's confession, the research proving we were wrong about ownership correspondence showing the lies went deeper than I imagined. He handed Declan the envelope without quite meeting his eyes, and Declan recognized the gesture for what it was. Not quite apology, not quite reconciliation, but acknowledgement that some truths were too heavy to carry alone. I've spent 10 years building a company based on believing my family deserved restitution for property stolen during the war. Turns out we were the thieves all along. These are promissory notes from German families my grandfather claimed had rights to the Kleinfeld collection. They're worthless legally, but I thought you should see them. Evidence of how deep the deception went, how many people my family convinced to believe lies. The admission seemed to cost him something fundamental, the particular armor successful people build against acknowledging they might be fundamentally wrong about important things. Vaughn looked at the farmhouse where lights glowed warm against the March twilight, then back at Declan with something that might have been regret. What will you do now? Start over. Honestly this time. Maybe that's what we Brennans need to learn, that integrity matters more than winning. He paused, one hand on his truck door. Your grandfather chose the right person. I can see that now. I should have seen it from the beginning. The art transfer happened over the following week with the methodical care treasures deserved after 70 years in darkness. Professional handlers arrived from the foundation specialists in moving pieces too valuable to risk with normal transportation. They excavated the root cellar with archaeological precision, documenting every stage, ensuring chain of custody remained unbroken for the legal proceedings that would eventually return each item to Kleinfeld descendants scattered across 3 continents. The cellar itself was larger than expected, its walls reinforced with stone and timber that had held for 8 decades. A military-grade dehumidifier hummed in one corner, newer than the structure itself. Gus had apparently maintained the space over decades, ensuring the environment stayed controlled even as he aged and the world changed around him. The level of care suggested this had been more than obligation. It had been a kind of communion with his brothers, a way of honoring promises that outlasted the men who made them. The wooden cabinet that held the collection was a work of art itself, handcrafted with dovetail joints and carefully carved molding built to withstand both time and tampering. The combination lock was military-grade, added after the original construction. The numbers carved faintly into the wood at the base provided the combination 1946-1942. The year the brothers bought the tractor and the year they entered military service, memorial dates that framed their final chapter together. Inside, protected by layers of oilcloth and acid-free paper that Gus must have replaced periodically over the decades, lay the pieces Emmett and Silas had protected. A small Rembrandt portrait, its dark background highlighting the subject's contemplative expression. 2 Klimt pieces recovered from an Austrian collection, their distinctive gold leaf still luminous. Medieval manuscripts illuminated by hand, priceless, not just for their monetary value, but for what they represented about human persistence in creating beauty. Jewish ceremonial objects in silver and gold, items that had witnessed births and deaths and celebrations across generations before being stolen and hidden, and now finally prepared for return. Neighbors gathered to witness history being made, phones recording as each carefully wrapped piece emerged into March sunlight. Dr. Adler supervised with intensity that suggested she'd spent her career preparing for this moment, every recovered treasure representing families destroyed and partially restored through the return of fragments that had survived when people couldn't. The reporters who'd attended the hearing came back with cameras, and by evening the story was spreading beyond Iowa, picked up by national news organizations interested in the intersection of World War II history and small-town drama. But the most moving discovery came last. Beneath the artwork, wrapped in the same wax canvas Gus had used to preserve the tractor, sat a small wooden box containing military medals that had belonged to Emmett and Silas. Bronze stars. Purple Hearts campaign ribbons from theaters of war that had consumed millions. And underneath the medals, a note in Gus's handwriting dated 1997, the 50th anniversary of Silas's death. I've kept our promise. The land remains in Hartwell hands. The treasures you protected continue to wait for their rightful moment of return. I talk to you both every day in the fields you loved beside the tractor you chose under the sky that covers us all. Until we meet again, your brother. Dr. Adler suggested the medals remain with the farm rather than joining the transported collection. These are family artifacts, not restitution items. Their proper place is here with the story of the men who earned them. As the transport vehicles departed with cargo worth more than every farm in Warren County combined, Declan stood in the yard with Iris's hand in his, watching the physical manifestation of 70 years of secrets disappear toward destinations where they belonged. The emptiness should have felt like loss, but instead it felt like completion, a circle closing that had been open since three brothers stood in front of a tractor and believed the future was something they could cultivate together. The practical questions remained. The California job offer had been rescinded during the week of legal proceedings, the startup deciding they needed someone who could start immediately rather than whenever family crises resolved. The severance was gone, spent on property taxes and legal fees not covered by the foundation's support. Declan's bank balance had 3 digits before the decimal point, and spring planting was approaching on fields he was still learning to read. But the foundation had proposed a partnership that served multiple purposes. A portion of the Hartwell farm would become an educational center focused on art restitution history and Holocaust remembrance, combining traditional agriculture with cutting-edge digital archive technology. The compensation wouldn't make Declan rich, but it would sustain the farm while he learned to manage land that had sustained 3 generations before him. Remote work opportunities were emerging too, positions that let him maintain technical skills while living somewhere his daughter could run without someone telling her to quiet down. The restoration economy was becoming viable in ways it hadn't been when Gus started farming 70 years ago. Technology enabling combinations of old and new that might have seemed impossible to men who'd never imagined the internet. Iris had transformed completely during their months in Iowa. The withdrawn city kid who'd arrived in September had become someone else entirely confident and grounded in ways that made Cordelia weep with relief during their weekly video calls. She'd made friends who lived on working farms, learned to collect eggs and feed chickens, and drive the tractor under Roscoe's supervision, joined the volleyball team and the 4-H club, and started talking about raising sheep for next year's county fair. When Cordelia called about custody arrangements in late March, her voice carried acceptance rather than anger. She's happy there, December. Really happy. I can hear it every time we talk, see it in the pictures she sends. Maybe Iowa's better for her than Chicago ever was. The admission felt like permission. Declan hadn't known he needed acknowledgement that sometimes the best decisions emerged from circumstances nobody planned. They agreed on arrangements that kept mother and daughter connected without forcing Iris back into a city that had never quite fit her. Summer visits, holidays, birthdays, celebrated with video calls when distance made presence impossible. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and honesty felt like a gift after years of pretending their marriage could survive the weight of accumulated disappointments. 1 year later, the educational center held its grand opening under September skies that carried the last warmth of summer before autumn asserted dominance. The converted barn section displayed the story of 3 brothers and the promises that had outlasted their lives. Monuments Men program documented alongside Kleinfeld family history the journey from theft through recovery to eventual restitution, traced in photographs and documents and carefully curated artifacts. The Victory Series tractor sat as centerpiece chrome gleaming under carefully positioned lights. Restoration complete after months of work that Roscoe had supervised with the attention usually reserved for religious devotion. The brass plaques told stories that made visitors pause and read twice. Victory Series, in honor of those who served 1946, property of E.S. and G. Hartwell, and below that a new edition commissioned by the Foundation, restored 2026, promise kept. Rachel Kleinfeld attended the opening despite being 83 and frail enough that travel from Vienna required medical support and family members willing to help manage the journey. She was the great niece of the family whose artwork had been stolen, hidden, protected, and finally returned. She'd survived the Holocaust as a hidden child, spent 70 years not knowing whether any of her family's cultural legacy had escaped destruction. When Dr. Adler had contacted her with news of the recovery, she'd wept for 3 days, grief and relief intermingling in ways that made separation impossible. Her speech, delivered in English accented by decades of living in Austria, reduced the assembled crowd to silence. She stood at the podium with her great niece supporting her elbow, looking out at farmers and townspeople and reporters who'd come to witness something that felt larger than the sum of its parts. My family's treasures were stolen by those who valued objects over human lives. The paintings and sculptures and ceremonial items you've returned to us, they represent more than beauty or wealth. They represent continuity, the insistence that we existed, that our lives mattered, that what was taken in violence could be returned through courage. She paused, gathering strength for what came next. Hidden by heroes who valued human dignity above orders, Emmett and Silas Hartwell, who risked their lives not just fighting a war, but preserving what wars destroy. Protected by a farmer who valued promises above ease, who carried secrets for 70 years because he believed some obligations transcend comfort or convenience. Her voice broke slightly, and her great-niece offered a steadying hand. Today these treasures are home in museums and private collections held by descendants my family didn't know survived. The Rembrandt hangs in Berlin, where it was meant to hang before everything was stolen. The Klimt pieces have gone to Tel Aviv to a museum my great-aunt helped found before the war. The ceremonial objects have returned to synagogues in 3 countries, still serving the purposes they were created for. And so, in a way, am I. Home. Standing here in Iowa, in a place my family never knew existed, talking to people they never met because 3 brothers made promises they kept even when keeping them cost everything. Iris, now 9 and official junior docent, gave tours to visiting school groups with the confidence of someone who'd internalized the story so completely it had become part of her identity. She explained her great-great-uncles with pride that made visitors smile, showed them the tractor that had held secrets for 70 years, pointed to maps and documents that proved ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they chose integrity over convenience. Declan watched from the doorway, phone buzzing with remote work calls he'd answer later. Balance achieved between technology and tradition that would have seemed impossible to men who'd farmed with muscle and determination alone. The center brought steady income. The farm brought purpose, and together they created sustainability that let him stay in a place that mattered more than ambition ever had. The evening celebration continued long after the formal program concluded. Tables laden with food prepared by neighbors who'd learned that Hartwell gatherings meant community rather than exclusion, that the farm which had been closed for so long was finally opening to the world. Roscoe and his family, Vinnie and the quilting circle she'd convinced to create memorial pieces for the museum farmers who'd helped excavate the tractor and lawyers who'd helped fight for the right to keep it. Vaughn came too, bringing his wife and teenage sons, the family dynamic subtly different in ways Declan couldn't quite articulate. His cousin had sold the development company, started working with a nonprofit that helped small towns preserve historic buildings. Not redemption exactly, but a deliberate pivot towards something that felt less like penance and more like choosing to be different than the men who'd come before. We're leaving tomorrow, heading back to Des Moines, but I wanted to say before we left that what you've done here matters. Not just the art return, though, that's significant. But this. He gestured toward the barn, the fields, the people gathered. You took something broken and made it mean something again. The words came awkwardly, like Vaughn was learning a language he'd never been taught, but the effort counted for more than eloquence. Declan accepted them with a nod, understanding that some relationships couldn't be rebuilt but could perhaps be reframed into something less damaging than what they'd been. As darkness settled and guests began departing with promises to return for harvest festivals and holiday celebrations, Declan and Iris walked the property together. The fields where winter wheat was beginning to show green, the barn where the tractor sat like a monument to persistence, the section that had been overgrown and is now documented and understood, every mystery solved and every promise accounted for. This feels right, doesn't it, Dad? Iris's question carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. The 8-year-old who'd arrived confused and hurting transformed into someone who understood that home was something you built rather than something you found. Declan felt the certainty settle through him, like the land itself was confirming her observation. More right than anything in a long time, sweetheart. They reached the oak tree where Emmett's letter had mentioned the brothers making their final promise before shipping out to war. The tree was ancient, probably old when those young men stood beneath it in 1942, its branches spreading wide enough to shelter generations of Hartwells who'd stood in its shadow and contemplated futures they couldn't predict. Declan touched bark that had witnessed that moment, felt connection to men who'd stood here when the world was different, but values were fundamentally the same. Promises mattered. Work done right endured. Land held memories better than people ever could, patient and permanent, in ways that made individual lives feel brief as mayfly dances. Can we plant something for them, so people remember? The suggestion felt exactly right. Continuation rather than conclusion. Honoring the past while building toward futures nobody could predict. They'd plant in spring when the ground was ready. Some tree that would outlast them both, grow strong on land. 3 brothers had loved enough to die for, and 1 brother had loved enough to protect for 70 years, passing that protection to a grandson who'd learned what inheritance really meant. The walk back towards the farmhouse took them past the barn where the tractor sat, past fields that would yield harvest, past the educational center where lights still glowed and a few lingering visitors examined displays. Everything about the scene suggested permanence, but Declan knew better now. Permanence was really just commitment. Renewed daily promises kept, not because they were easy, but because they connected you to something larger than individual ambition or comfort. Inside the farmhouse smelled like the dinner Vinnie had supervised, pot roast using a recipe she claimed came from Gus's mother, though Declan suspected she'd adapted it to modern tastes. The kitchen table could seat 12 if you squeezed, and tonight it would need to. Cordelia was arriving tomorrow for a weekend visit, the first since they'd worked out their new normal. Roscoe's family had been invited for Sunday dinner. The foundation representatives wanted to discuss expansion plans for the educational center. But for now it was just Declan and Iris, father and daughter, standing in a kitchen that had witnessed more history than either of them could fully comprehend, part of a story that had started before they were born and would continue after they were gone. The land would endure beyond them, beyond everyone currently standing on it. Indifferent to the brief flicker of human ambition, but somehow enriched by the promises people chose to keep. Iris ran ahead to wash up for bed, leaving Declan alone in the growing darkness. Through the windows he could see the outlines of fields and barn and the oak tree where 3 brothers had once stood and believed the future was something they could cultivate together. They'd been wrong about the specifics, about who would survive and who would fall, about how long their promises would take to fulfill. But they'd been right about what mattered. Right that land connected generations in ways that transcended individual lives. Right that promises kept in secret could echo louder than victories proclaimed in public. Right that sometimes the greatest inheritance wasn't property or money, but the obligation to finish what others had started, to honor what they'd protected, to keep faith with people who'd trusted you across distances you couldn't measure in miles or years. Gus had known somehow that Declan would understand this, had seen something in a curious boy who asked questions nobody else bothered asking, who wanted to know the real stories instead of the comfortable fictions families told themselves. Had trusted that curiosity would lead to discovery, and discovery would lead to choice, and choice would lead to standing in a kitchen in Iowa with flour on the counter and dinner in the oven, and a daughter whose laughter drifted down from upstairs where she was probably reading instead of getting ready for bed. Sometimes we're chosen not for who we are, but for who we might become, and the only way to discover which is to be brave enough to try. Declan had tried, was still trying, would keep trying as long as the land beneath his feet and the daughter in his keeping and the legacy in his trust demanded it. That was enough. That would always be enough.